Now we're moving on to the second part of this course, programs. We've talked about topics. Topics generate the programs. And I've kind of already hinted, of course, at many of the programs that come from Congress to the executive branch of the United States government, then down to states, and then down to local governments. Here you can see on the Census Bureau's mission page about what we do. And they have a mission statement. Their authority is under the Titles 13 and 26 of the United States Code. Their goal is to provide relevant, quality, and cost-effective data. And then in general, again, here are those major topics: population, housing, economic, governments. Now, though, what we're seeing there, when it says what data we collect and when, those are programs. The Population and Housing Census program is every 10 years. The Economic Census's program is every 5 years. Same with Census of Governments. The American Community Survey is an annual survey. So now we're taking topics, putting them into real programs which have recurring activities and products. Continuing here on what we do, I clicked on surveys. Here are other surveys. The Census Bureau collects information in many other surveys and provides the data to the sponsor. These include the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that's the Department of Justice. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's the Department of Labor. Transportation Statistics is Department of Transportation, and there's HUD, and there's Department of Education, and Health Statistics is Health and Human Services, National Science Foundation, Social Security. On the lower right, you can see again how the economic data is divided up by the many sectors of the economy. These are standard classification groups within the basic field of economics. Now I want to back up and tell a little story about it, and you'll understand why in a minute when we get to products. Prior to Census 2010, new topics were added to each decennial census from about 1800 on. Remember, the first census was in 1790, and then every 10 years, the federal government has had a census and always produced population data. But because this was such a big deal and the government was putting out all this effort to count people, many times they added additional topics. And the census began to grow and grow and grow all through the 1800s. They started asking questions about agriculture, cattle, how much crops did you grow, machinery, occupations, and so on and so on. It got to be kind of unwieldy. Up in 1940, from 1940 to the 2000 census, the format was to divide the census into two types of questionnaires that went out to all the households in the country. Most people got what was called the short form, and this was called the 100% data. It was only about 8 questions, the very basic questions. Who lives there, age, sex, relationships to the reference person, housing unit vacant or not, and that was about it. And these data were then available down to every single block, those 11 million blocks throughout the country. 1 in 6 households received the sample form, or called the long form. That literally was a long form, and it had a lot of those other questions: education, what is your language, where were you born, where did you live 5 years ago. And that was called the sample data. And of course, sample data is then weighted by sampling to reflect the total population. Beginning in the late 1990s, the census and the Congress began to discuss an alternative way of doing the census. These censuses, 1970, 1980, 1990, were just getting to be really expensive and difficult to administer. Every census involved hiring and training almost 500,000 people or more, opening up 500 offices across the country, running these operations for 9 months, payrolls, and so forth. It was a huge spike in the budget and very difficult to manage with temporary staff. So the decision was made in the late 1990s to separate the sample data from the census. And this was first tried out in Census 2010. In Census 2010, the only form sent out was the short form. That was it. In the meantime, operating in the background separately was a new, large, national continuous survey that replaced the decennial sample form. And that's called the American Community Survey, or ACS. ACS is now becoming kind of the backbone of the Census Bureau's data programs, and what we're going to talk about a lot, because it is the motherlode of data that most people are going to use for most applications. But I just wanted to give some background and note to most of you who might still remember, ACS is replacing the sample data. For example, here if you look at from Census 2000, the first products took almost 2 years to produce. And up there you can see the 100 and sample profiles came out in June of 2002. That's 2 years, more than 2 years after the census, which was April of 2000. And you can see some of the dates down there where the data products would take 3-7 years to get produced because of the way the census was conducted. So the Census Bureau wanted to shorten those time frames and produce more timely data. So they created ACS. The goal was to provide timely, annual, detailed sample data for the whole country. Now, how do you do that? Well, it's a sample, it's a survey. So let's back up a minute and look back at Census 2000 and those old censuses. The sample size was 1 out of 6, or roughly 16% of all households would get the long form. The ACS sample is 3.2 million households out of 132 million households in the country, or roughly 2.4%. You see, much smaller sample. So that means the data is not as robust for many of these detailed tabulations. So what was the answer? ACS came up with what's called a multi-year rolling sample. ACS accumulates the survey data to increase the sample size by simply adding years, and you end up with 3 types of ACS. The 1-year data, where the sample size is 2.4%, 3 years of ACS data, that triples the sample size to 7.2%, and 5 years of ACS data, which is a sample size of 12%. The result is 3 products, the 1, the 3, and the 5-year data. As each year goes by, you add the newest year and you drop the oldest year. That's why it's called a rolling multi-year survey. Here's an image of the American Community Survey on the right. It says, "Start here. Please complete this form and return as soon as possible." This booklet shows the content of the ACS questionnaire. Behind it on the left is the Census 2010 questionnaire. And if you were to look at these close up, you'd see that they're almost identical in the wording of a lot of the basic questions. They are designed to mimic the short and the long form format of all the previous censuses. So if you ask the question, is ACS a substitute or replace the long form data from the Census 2000, the answer is yes. It is intended to replace the long form data. But there's a catch there, and we're going to talk about that. Here's some more examples of questions in the ACS. And I wanted to show you these because in the creation of a question, you have to make decisions on how you ask it that may or may not reflect everyone's interpretation of the topic. For example, 10A, and this is about were you enrolled in school in the last 3 months. So the Census Bureau and the agency sponsoring this have decided that they're going to ask this question in this way. In the last 3 months, were you in school or college? And then it goes on to say, what is schools or college? Nursery, preschool, kindergarten, homeschooling is included, or schooling which leads to a high school diploma or a college degree. Now, this does not include a correspondence course on art or some other types of training that you might be doing that doesn't lead to a degree or a high school degree. So they're defining these topics in the questions. Now earlier I said that the sample size for ACS is relatively small on a 1 year, 2.4% of the population at most in a 1 year ACS data, and that the years are accumulated to get the sample size larger. That leads to some specific numerical cutoffs for which these data are available. So, with apologies, size does matter. You can match the ACS products to population size. This is done for you, and this determines what products are available from the ACS program. ACS 1-year data is available for states, MSA, which stands for Metropolitan Statistical Areas, big places, places being cities, over 65,000 population, and counties of over 65,000 population. So literally geographies with over 65,000 will have ACS 1-year data every year. And that's great. That is almost real-time data. It's usually a year old. 2012 data are released in 2013, but that's leaps and bounds better than only having data every 10 years. The ACS 3-year data, as you can see, takes the threshold down to 20,000 people. Now you're picking up small towns, small counties throughout the country. The difference is it's a 3-year data set. And then finally, the 5-year data, which is meant to replace the sample data from Census 2000, takes you all the way down to census tracts, really small census-designated places, little corner communities of several hundred people, and basically as low as confidentiality will allow. Confidentiality meaning the Census Bureau will not publish data if it could lead to the identification of a real person. There'll just be asterisks in there. So when you get down this low, sometimes data is what's called suppressed for privacy. Now, these data are presented in ACS with what's called the margin of error. Because it's a sample, they're publishing the margin of error, which gives you an indication of the quality of the data, and sometimes the 5-year data has a really high margin of error. That's not good. Sometimes the data are there, they're published, but you really can't use it. It's not good data. More about that later. The ACS topics basically mimic the topics we've talked about earlier: administrative data, basic population, social characteristics, housing, financial, housing physical, quality, economic, meaning employment, what's your job, what was income sources, what is your income, and then there are geographic data for every ACS product. What is the identity of the geography, and what are some characteristics, land area, for example, being derived from the geography.